The cascade failure began with a sound that Noel Vander later described as a polite disagreement between two systems that were about to become a very impolite one. He was in the technical observation bay, reviewing the navigation array's power distribution logs, when the first anomaly registered, a variance so small that the automated monitoring had flagged it at the lowest priority level and moved on. Noel looked at it for a moment with the particular attention of someone who had spent 11 years finding the small things that the automated monitoring had decided not to worry about. He was reaching for the intercom when the second anomaly registered. And the third. What followed was 22 minutes that he would subsequently be able to reconstruct in considerable technical detail, though he did not remember them that way at the time. The crew performed with the precision of people whose training had prepared them for emergencies, and whose training, it turned out, had been very good. The vessel did not break apart. It did not burn. It descended through the atmosphere of an uncharted world in the rocky outer reach of an unregistered system, in a trajectory that the surviving instruments would later classify as a controlled emergency landing, which was accurate in the same way that describing a building implosion as a rapid structural reorganization was accurate. It came down in a valley between two ridgelines, on ground that was flat enough and soft enough to matter, and stopped. Noel was still holding the edge of his console. He ran the standard checks the way he ran all checks, starting with the most critical systems and working outward, not because it was protocol, but because it was the only way to understand what you actually had. Life support, functional. Hull integrity, compromised in 3 sections, none immediately critical. Navigation, non-functional in every sense that counted. Communications, the emergency beacon was transmitting. Whether it was transmitting to anyone was a different question. He became aware, in the specific way of someone who has been focused on systems and is now returning to the world around them, that there was someone else in the observation bay. She was standing at the viewport, looking at the planet outside, with the concentrated stillness of a person taking inventory of a situation. She had a cut along her left forearm that she had not addressed yet and was clearly aware of and had decided was the lower priority. Her long ears, tapering elegantly, were slightly angled. He had been around enough Vahari in the past month to know this was a listening posture, though there was nothing out there to listen to yet. "The crew," she said, without turning. "I don't know yet," he said. "I was about to find out." She turned then and looked at him with the direct, practical attention of someone who has decided that this is the situation and is now assessing what can be done about it. "Then let's find out," she said. They were the only survivors. The crew of 4 had managed the descent and not survived the impact point, which was the particular cruelty of emergencies that were mostly controlled. Noel sat with this for exactly as long as he could afford to, and then returned to the system's assessment. Because grief and logistics are not mutually exclusive, but one of them keeps you alive, and the other can wait its turn. Princess Thessaly of the Vahari stood beside him at the system's console, and did not offer condolences, and did not perform distress, and did not ask questions that couldn't be answered yet. She read the diagnostic outputs over his shoulder in silence. "The beacon is active," she said. "Yes," he said. "How long before anyone could respond to it?" "Best case, 2 weeks. Worst case, nobody has the range to receive it, and we work on a different plan." She nodded as though this were a project parameter rather than the summary of their situation. "What do we need first?" she said. He looked at her. "Water," he said. "Then let's start there," she said. The valley provided. Not generously, it was not that kind of planet, but adequately, which was all that survival required. There was water in a stream 200 meters from the crash site, clean enough after filtration from the vessel's surviving systems. There was vegetation that the ship's biological scanner confirmed was not harmful to either human or Vahari physiology. There was timber in the form of the dense, low trees that covered the valley floor, which Noel assessed for structural load-bearing with the eye of a man who had built field shelters before and found them adequate. The first 3 days had the clarifying quality of problems that are large enough to prevent you from thinking about anything else. This was, Noel privately acknowledged, not the worst thing about the situation. He worked through the salvage assessment methodically. What could be repowered? What could be repurposed? What was structural loss and needed to be documented and released? The vessel's emergency kit was designed for 2 people for 30 days, which gave them a baseline from which to calculate the gap between what they had and what they needed. Thessaly worked alongside him from the first morning. This surprised him, and then it didn't, and then he examined why it had surprised him in the first place, and found the answer was one he was not proud of. He had assumed that a princess would require managing. She did not require managing. She required, initially, to be shown the systems, and after that she required only to be left to work, which she did with a focus that had the quality of a person who has discovered something they are good at and finds the discovery privately satisfying. She was stronger than she looked, which was itself more than it should have been, and she had the spatial reasoning of someone who thought structurally. She understood how components fit together before she understood what they were called, and adjusted her vocabulary accordingly. On the second afternoon, she identified a power coupling configuration in the secondary battery, array that Noelle had been looking at for 2 hours, and had almost decided was non-recoverable. If you reverse the input sequence, she said, pointing, the polarity conflict resolves. He looked at it, she was right. Where did you learn that? He said. I didn't, she said. It's just what the geometry requires. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a man updating a model. You're good at this, he said. She looked slightly surprised, not at the statement, but at her own response to it, as though being good at something she had not been trained for was a category she had not previously had occasion to occupy. There was never a reason to find out before, she said. He nodded and handed her the coupling tool. The court, he was beginning to understand, had not known who it was working with. By the 3rd week they had a routine, which was the word for the shape that survival takes when it becomes sustainable enough to repeat. The power systems were stable. The shelter, an expansion of the vessel's intact forward section, reinforced with timber framing, in a configuration that Noelle had drawn on the hull with a piece of salvaged metal, and Thessaly had improved in 2 specific ways before they started building, was weatherproof and warm. The food rationing was calculated to last 6 weeks at full ration or 9 at reduced, and they were eating at a point between the two that Noelle had worked out as optimal, and Thessaly had checked his arithmetic on without being asked. The evenings were the part that neither of them had planned for. Work ended when the light did, because the valley's solar cycle was short and the vessel's power was not unlimited, and darkness arrived earlier than either of them preferred. They ate and they talked, in the way that people talk when there is no reason not to be honest and no audience for anything else. The planet was an efficient editor of pretense. Thessaly talked about her life with the specific candor of someone trying it out, testing whether the words fit the experience, revising where they didn't. She had been prepared from early childhood for a role whose requirements had been defined long before she could have an opinion about them. She was good at it, she said, in the way of someone who has worked very hard at something they did not choose. She had not previously had occasion to consider whether she was good at other things. Noelle talked about 11 years of finding the small errors that the automated systems decided not to worry about, and how that had become the shape of his career by accident and his vocation by the time he noticed. He talked about being good at a thing that most people found difficult to explain to other people at social occasions. He talked about this with the dry self-awareness of a man who has made his peace with something and found the peace was actually comfortable. The humor that developed between them arrived sideways and built gradually, the specific kind that forms between people under pressure, which has no patience for anything that isn't true. She said things that were funny in the way of someone who had not previously had much occasion for it and was finding the occasion suited her. He recognized this the way he recognized the polarity conflict she had identified in the coupling as something that had always been there, simply waiting for the geometry to require it. On the 29th day, the beacon received a response. He was running the morning systems check when it came through, a Vahari search frequency, not strong but present, asking for confirmation of the source signal. He sent the confirmation with the specific, focused calm of someone who has spent 29 days deciding that hoping was an inefficient use of processing power and is now revising that position. He went to find Thessaly. She was at the stream, filling the filtration canteen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this every morning for 4 weeks. She looked at his face before he said anything. "The beacon," she said. "They're in range," he said. 2 days, maybe 3. She was quiet. He had expected relief, and she had it, he could see it. The specific release of attention held so long it had become structural. But there was something else in her expression that he recognized because he was, in his modest way, good at reading the things that the monitoring systems decided were lowest priority. 2 days, she said. Maybe 3, he said. She looked at the valley, the ridgelines, the low trees, the vessel they had turned into a home by the slow accumulation of necessity and effort. The planet that had not cared about either of them and had, in its indifference, given them something they could not have found anywhere that did. I know, he said, which was presumptuous, probably, but she didn't correct him. They stood at the stream in the morning light and let the valley be what it was for 2 more days. The rescue vessel was Vahari military, efficient and formal, and it arrived with the particular energy of people who have been searching for something and are relieved to have found it and are expressing this relief through the medium of procedure. There were medics and debrief officers and a senior diplomatic attaché who addressed Thessaly with the full formal weight of her title in a way that Noelle watched her receive, correctly, graciously, and with the faint quality of someone putting on a coat they had grown slightly too large for. She was a princess again. This was right and necessary, and he had never thought of her as anything else, exactly, but the planet had added a layer to the word that the coat did not quite cover. He completed his technical debrief in a side compartment with an officer who asked good questions, and recorded his answers with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the navigation failure would need to be fully understood before anyone flew this corridor again. Noelle answered completely and accurately and felt, throughout, the specific dissonance of describing 29 days of his life in the language of incident reports. Thessaly found him on the observation deck as the rescue vessel cleared the atmosphere. The planet receded below them, the valley, the ridgelines, the crash site that they had turned into a place where 2 people learned who they were without any of the usual equipment. "How are you?" she said. "Thinking," he said. "About." He looked at the planet getting smaller. "About the difference between a situation and a place," he said. "We were in a situation, but it became a place. Those are different things." She stood beside him and looked at it too. She had her formal bearing back, the composed, structural quality of someone who carries a title well, but her long ears were angled the way he had learned to read, the listening posture, which was not a formal bearing at all, but simply who she was when she was actually present. "When we land," she said, "there will be a great deal of process. Medical assessment, diplomatic notifications, investigative review. It will take some time before anything resembling a normal conversation is possible." "I know," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "before we land, that the 29 days were not something I will be able to explain to anyone who was not there. But I did not want to arrive at a world with people in it without first saying that they were," she paused, with the specific pause of someone being precise. "They were the most honest days I have had, and you were the reason a significant part of that was possible, rather than simply survivable." Noelle looked at the planet, now small enough to hold between 2 fingers. He thought about polarity conflicts and coupling configurations, and the specific quality of a person discovering what they are good at when the geometry finally requires it. "When the process is done," he said, "and something resembling a normal conversation is possible." "Yes," she said before he finished. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, simply, and with the directness of someone who has spent 29 days on a planet with no patience for anything that isn't true and has not yet entirely left it behind. The planet disappeared into the dark below them. They stood together on the observation deck and let it go, and turned, together, toward whatever the geometry of what came next would require.